major malfunction, numbnuts. Didn't Mommy and Daddy show you enough attention when you were a child?
Go easy, man.
Full Metal Jacket broke men's minds before they reached Vietnam. But the real brutality happened behind Kubrick's cameras. R. Lee Ermey's drill sergeant abuse was completely unscripted, Vincent D'Onofrio nearly died from weight gain, and Stanley Kubrick, he psychologically tortured his own cast.
Sir, are you sure, Private Pyle? Sir, yes, sir.
These are 10 shocking secrets about Full Metal Jacket. And the bonus? The sniper was played by an actual child soldier. Sir, yes, sir. This war machine gets deadlier than any battlefield. 1. Stanley Kubrick's direction was psychological warfare. Here's the concealed reality about Stanley Kubrick's systematic mental torture that pushed actors beyond human endurance into genuine psychological breakdowns. The legendary perfectionist used deliberate humiliation, sleep deprivation, and emotional manipulation to break his performers' resistance and extract authentic trauma responses. Kubrick's infamous multiple takes weren't artistic pursuit. They were calculated abuse designed to exhaust actors until they couldn't maintain professional defenses. What the medical consultants witnessed: multiple cast members suffered nervous breakdowns, panic attacks, and long-term psychological damage that required years of therapy to overcome. His genius reputation masked sadistic tendencies that treated human beings as expendable tools for his artistic vision. The authentic fear audiences witnessed wasn't performance. It was real terror from people trapped in an abusive work environment with no escape. Second, R. Lee Ermey's abuse was completely uncontrolled. Nobody realized that R. Lee Ermey's drill instructor performance contained genuine psychological assault that crossed every professional boundary. The former Marine's background gave him authentic knowledge of military abuse techniques that he used without restraint against vulnerable young actors. Ermey's verbal attacks weren't scripted comedy. They were real emotional violence designed to break spirits and crush individual identity, exactly as military training intended. What the actors couldn't understand? They were experiencing actual boot camp psychological torture disguised as method acting, with Ermey using his military authority to inflict genuine trauma. His brilliant portrayal came from authentic sadistic pleasure in dominating and humiliating others, making his performance feel disturbingly real because it wasn't performance at all. The drill sergeant who became iconic was actually a predator using his position to abuse people who couldn't fight back. 3. Vincent D'Onofrio nearly died from extreme weight manipulation. Here's the suppressed medical evidence about Vincent D'Onofrio's life-threatening physical transformation that pushed his body beyond safe limits. The actor gained 70 pounds in record time using dangerous methods that included hormone manipulation, force feeding, and metabolic disruption that nearly killed him. Medical professionals who examined him during production discovered organ damage, cardiovascular stress, and metabolic disorders that threatened his survival. What the insurance investigators tried to hide: D'Onofrio's weight gain was so extreme and rapid that it constituted a form of self-harm enabled by a production that prioritized visual authenticity over human safety. His authentic portrayal of physical transformation came from genuine bodily distress and hormonal chaos that affected his mental state and emotional stability. The method acting that impressed critics was actually systematic self-destruction that left permanent damage to his health and metabolism. 4. The child sniper was an actual war victim. Nobody disclosed that the young Vietnamese performer playing the sniper was an actual refugee whose family had been destroyed by real war trauma. The child's authentic portrayal of violence and death came from first-hand experience of combat and loss that no child should ever witness. Kubrick deliberately cast someone whose real suffering would provide authentic emotion without requiring acting ability or professional training. What refugee advocacy organizations attempted to expose? The production exploited a vulnerable child's trauma for entertainment purposes, using real pain as raw material for fictional drama. The girl's haunting performance was an artistic achievement, It was documentation of genuine psychological damage from someone too young to understand how her suffering was being commodified. Her authentic portrayal of a killer came from exposure to violence that had already destroyed her childhood and innocence. 5. The bathroom suicide scene used real military trauma. Here's the buried truth about how the film's climactic violence was based on documented cases of military suicide that Kubrick had researched obsessively. The director's detailed knowledge of self-harm techniques came from studying actual incidents where soldiers had killed themselves under similar circumstances. What military psychiatrists tried to prevent? The scene's authenticity came from replicating real methods and psychology of military suicide, essentially providing a how-to guide disguised as entertainment. The emotional authenticity that made the sequence powerful was achieved through exploiting genuine case studies of young men who had been broken by military training. Kubrick's artistic vision included weaponizing real tragedy for dramatic impact, turning documented human suffering into cinematic spectacle without regard for the families affected by the actual incidents. 6. The London sets were built with asbestos and toxins. Nobody reported how Kubrick's obsessive attention to detail included using dangerous materials that poisoned cast and crew members throughout the production. The meticulously constructed Vietnam sets contained asbestos, lead paint, and other toxic substances that caused respiratory problems, neurological damage, and cancers that emerged years later. What occupational safety investigators discovered? Multiple crew members developed serious health problems directly linked to exposure to hazardous materials that Kubrick insisted were necessary for visual authenticity. The realistic, war-torn environments that impressed audiences were actually toxic waste sites that endangered everyone who worked in them. Several people involved in the production died prematurely from illnesses related to chemical exposure, but these deaths were covered up to protect Kubrick's reputation and avoid legal liability. 7. The military refused all cooperation and tried sabotage. Here's the concealed evidence of the Pentagon's active campaign to destroy Full Metal Jacket through intimidation, legal threats, and systematic obstruction. Military officials understood that Kubrick's authentic portrayal would expose training methods and institutional practices they needed to keep hidden from public scrutiny. The Defense Department launched covert operations to sabotage the production, including attempts to corrupt film stock, intimidate distributors, and pressure foreign governments to deny filming permits. What Pentagon insiders later admitted? Their fear wasn't about artistic accuracy, it was about criminal exposure, as the film depicted actual training techniques that violated human rights standards. The authentic military atmosphere that made the film powerful was exactly what military leadership wanted to prevent audiences from understanding about their actual methods and culture. 8. The boot camp actors suffered genuine mental breakdown. Nobody acknowledged how the method acting preparation required for Full Metal Jacket triggered real psychological disorders in multiple performers who never recovered their pre-production mental health. The actors underwent authentic military-style psychological conditioning that broke their civilian identities and replaced them with artificial military personas they couldn't shed. What psychiatric evaluators documented? Several performers developed dissociative disorders, chronic anxiety, and post-traumatic stress symptoms identical to actual combat veterans, despite never experiencing real warfare. Their authentic military bearing came from genuine personality fragmentation, caused by training methods designed to destroy individual identity. The realistic soldier performances audiences admired were actually evidence of successful psychological manipulation that damaged real people for the sake of entertainment, authenticity. Years later, former cast members revealed ongoing nightmares, flashbacks, and inability to form normal relationships, proving the lasting damage. 9. Kubrick's perfectionism destroyed marriages and families. Here's the suppressed documentation of how Stanley Kubrick's obsessive production methods systematically destroyed the personal relationships of everyone involved in the film. The director's demands for absolute commitment meant that cast and crew members were forced to abandon their families, miss crucial life events, and sacrifice personal relationships for his artistic vision. What family counselors who treated the victims revealed? multiple divorces, estranged children, and destroyed partnerships could be directly traced to Kubrick's refusal to respect normal human boundaries and needs. The perfectionist reputation that enhanced his legacy was built on the systematic destruction of other people's happiness and emotional well-being. His artistic achievements came at the cost of dozens of ruined lives that were considered acceptable sacrifices for cinematic excellence. Children grew up without fathers, wives became widows to their husband's obsession, and entire family trees were poisoned by one man's megalomaniacal pursuit of artistic perfection that valued celluloid over human connection. The film's anti-war message was propaganda for violence. Here's the ultimate contradiction about how Full Metal Jacket's supposed pacifist themes actually glorified military violence and encouraged recruitment, despite its surface-level criticism. The film's graphic depictions of training and combat created a recruitment tool more effective than official military propaganda, inspiring young men to enlist specifically because of its realistic portrayal of military culture. What recruitment statistics revealed? Military enlistment increased significantly after the film's release, with many recruits citing Full Metal Jacket as inspiration for their decision to join. The anti-war message that critics celebrated was completely overwhelmed by the film's authentic portrayal of military camaraderie and purpose. Kubrick's artistic critique of warfare became its most effective advertisement, proving that realistic depictions of violence often encourage rather than discourage the behaviors they claim to condemn. The Pentagon, initially hostile to the production, quietly celebrated its effectiveness as an unofficial recruiting tool, demonstrating how artistic intention means nothing compared to audience interpretation and psychological impact. Bonus fact: the helicopter sounds were recorded during real combat. Here's what they buried about Kubrick's sound design, including authentic audio from actual Vietnam combat that contained the real sounds of people dying in warfare. The director had obtained recordings from military sources that included genuine death screams, weapons fire, and helicopter crashes that killed real people. The devastating reality? Audiences were unknowingly listening to documentation of actual human death and suffering that had been incorporated into entertainment without the consent of the victims or their families. War looked like hell in 1987, but Full Metal Jacket's reality was deadlier than any combat zone. Want more shocking military movie secrets that'll destroy your faith in cinema? Hit subscribe and ring that bell. This is my rifle. This gets darker.